The Burlington 1971 cold case that shattered a quiet Vermont community was solved 52 years later, and the arrest shocked everyone who thought they knew the truth. Rita Curran, a beloved 24-year-old Catholic schoolteacher, was found strangled in her apartment on a sweltering July night, cigarette smoke still lingering in the air when police arrived at dawn. For 5 decades, her family lit candles and prayed for justice while detectives chased ghosts through dead-end leads and fading memories. The killer had been hiding in plain sight, living just 2 floors above Rita's apartment, offering police a friendly alibi through his nervous young wife, then disappearing into decades of silence. When DNA technology finally spoke where witnesses couldn't, it revealed a betrayal so close to home that neighbors still struggled to believe it. The man they'd passed in hallways, the quiet newlywed who'd helped search for clues he'd been the monster all along. But how does a community heal when the evil lived among them for 50 years, and justice comes only after the killer has escaped earthly punishment? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Rita Curran woke before dawn on the 26th of July, 1971, as she did every Monday morning. Her small Burlington apartment filled with the gentle sounds of preparation, water running, pages turning, the soft hum of her voice, practicing the day's lessons. At 24, Rita had found her calling in the classroom, where children's faces brightened when she entered, and parents trusted her with their most precious gift. She dressed carefully in a blue cotton dress, pinning her dark hair back with the silver clip her mother had given her for Christmas. The lesson plan book lay open on her kitchen table, filled with her neat handwriting, detailing math exercises, and reading assignments. She'd stayed up late the night before, crafting activities that would keep her summer school students engaged despite the July heat. Walking to school, Rita greeted Mrs. Patterson, watering her roses, and waved to Mr. Henderson, painting his front porch. Burlington felt safe in those early morning hours, when church bells chimed the hour and neighbors called out friendly hellos across tree-lined streets. The elementary school building stood solid and welcoming, its brick facade promising another day of learning and laughter. In her classroom, Rita arranged books on desks and wrote the day's agenda on the blackboard in her careful script. When students arrived, she welcomed each by name, asking about weekend adventures and family news. Her gift was making every child feel seen, heard, and valued. The hours passed in the familiar rhythm of lessons, recess supervision, and gentle corrections. Rita helped struggling readers sound out difficult words and celebrated when shy students found their voices. During lunch, she ate a sandwich at her desk while reviewing afternoon plans, her devotion evident in every thoughtful detail. After school, she stayed late to organize materials for the next day, humming hymns as she worked. The janitor, locking up nearby classrooms, smiled at her dedication. No one could have guessed how quickly her safe world would shatter. The summer evening stretched long and peaceful as Rita walked home from school, her leather satchel heavy with papers to grade. Burlington's elm-shaded streets hummed with quiet life, children catching fireflies, families finishing dinner on front porches, the distant sound of a baseball game on someone's radio. Her apartment building stood 3 stories tall on a corner lot, its red brick facade weathered but solid. Rita climbed the wooden stairs to the 2nd floor, keys jingling softly as she unlocked her door. The small space felt like sanctuary after a long day. Simple furniture arranged with care, religious prints on the walls, and fresh flowers from her mother's garden brightening the windowsill. She kicked off her teaching shoes and padded to the kitchen in stocking feet, opening the refrigerator for cold milk and yesterday's leftover meatloaf. The evening routine brought comfort, grading papers at the small table, radio playing softly in the background, the gradual settling of the building as neighbors returned from work. After dinner, Rita opened her journal, a birthday gift from her sister, and wrote about the day's small victories and challenges. Her handwriting flowed across lined pages, documenting hopes for difficult students, gratitude for small breakthroughs, and plans for upcoming lessons. She wrote about her dreams too: marriage someday, children of her own, a house with a garden where she could grow vegetables and flowers. The journal entry ended with her evening prayers, carefully inscribed as always. She thanked God for another day of teaching, asked for strength to reach every student, and prayed for her family's health and happiness. The words came from deep faith, rooted in childhood Sundays and reinforced by daily practice. Rita closed the journal and placed it beside her bedside lamp. She changed into her nightgown, washed her face, and brushed her teeth, following the same routine that had carried her through countless peaceful evenings. The apartment settled into darkness around her, quiet except for the occasional creak of old wood and distant murmur of voices from upstairs. By morning, the classroom that should have been filled with children's voices would fall silent. The summer night pressed heavy against Rita's windows as she settled into bed with a book, the familiar comfort of evening prayers still warm in her heart. Her Above her apartment, floorboards creaked with the movement of neighbors William DeRoos and his young wife, newlyweds, who kept to themselves but nodded politely in the hallways. Rita read for a while, the bedside lamp casting soft light across the pages. Outside, Burlington slept peacefully, its streets empty except for the occasional car passing beneath streetlights. The building held the quiet sounds of evening routines, running water, closing doors, the settling of old wood and plaster walls. She marked her place in the book and turned off the lamp, moonlight filtering through thin curtains to outline familiar furniture. The apartment felt secure, surrounded by neighbors, and wrapped in the safety of a small town where people looked out for each other. Rita had no reason to fear the darkness or question the footsteps that moved quietly in the hallway above, but evil doesn't announce itself with warnings or wear identifying marks. Sometimes it lives 2 floors up, sharing morning greetings and evening silences. Sometimes it smokes cigarettes and offers helpful alibis when police come asking questions. Sometimes it hides behind the face of an ordinary neighbor until the moment it reveals its true nature. The attack came without warning in those darkest hours before dawn. Rita never had a chance to scream or run or fight back effectively. Her bedroom became a battlefield where innocence met violence, where a teacher's gentle hands could not defend against a killer's grip. The struggle was brief but vicious, her assailant's rage overwhelming her completely. Cigarette smoke lingered in the still air as her killer left, the apartment falling silent, except for the distant hum of traffic and the ticking of Rita's bedside clock. Her lesson plan book lay open on the kitchen table, tomorrow's activities carefully outlined in her neat handwriting, a future that would never unfold. Children who would never again see her welcoming smile. The cigarette continued burning nearby, its ash growing long in the darkness, leaving evidence that would remain silent for 50 years until technology finally gave it voice. Dawn crept slowly across Burlington on the 27th of July, 1971, bringing with it the gradual realization that something had gone terribly wrong. Rita Curran's alarm clock rang at 6:30, as it did every morning, but no hand reached out to silence it. The sound carried through thin walls until it finally wound down, leaving the apartment eerily quiet. At the elementary school, Rita's absence sparked immediate concern. She had never missed a day without calling, never left her students without explanation. The principal tried her apartment number repeatedly, letting the phone ring and ring into empty air. By 8 o'clock, worry had crystallized into action. Rita's roommate, Sarah, returned from her weekend visit to family and found the apartment door unlocked, unusual for security-conscious Rita. She called out as she entered, expecting to find her friend sick in bed or running late for school. Instead, she discovered Rita's body in the bedroom, and her screams shattered the morning calm. The first police officer arrived within minutes, his radio crackling with urgent requests for backup, and the coroner. Detective Harris, a 20-year veteran with graying temples and careful eyes, took charge of the scene. He'd worked murders before, but not like this, not involving a beloved teacher in their quiet community. The apartment filled with investigators photographing everything, dusting for fingerprints, collecting evidence with methodical precision. Neighbors gathered in the hallway, whispering questions and theories. The cigarette butts found near Rita's body were bagged and labeled, though their significance wouldn't be understood for decades. Word spread quickly through Burlington's tight-knit network of schools, churches, and neighborhoods. Parents received urgent phone calls about summer school cancellation. Teachers wept in faculty lounges. Children asked questions their parents couldn't answer about why Miss Curran wouldn't be returning to her classroom. Rita's mother received the devastating call at home, her legs giving way as the words sank in. Church bells were ringing across the city as she collapsed in grief, their sound now forever linked to the worst day of her life. News of Rita Curran's murder spread through Burlington like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. By midday, every church congregation, every school staff room, every neighborhood gathering place buzzed with shocked whispers and disbelieving questions. How could this happen here? Who could do such a thing to someone so beloved? Parishioners at St. Joseph's Church, where Rita had attended Mass since childhood, gathered in small groups after morning service. Their voices carried the weight of communal grief as they shared memories of her gentle nature and dedication to teaching. Father Murphy's sermon that Sunday would focus on light persisting through darkness, though his own voice would tremble with sorrow. At the elementary school, teachers struggled to explain Rita's absence to confused students. Children who had looked forward to summer classes with Miss Curran instead found empty desks and tearful adults. The principal cancelled remaining summer sessions, sending families home with questions they couldn't answer and fears they couldn't voice. Detective Harris and his team spent the day canvassing Rita's apartment building, interviewing every resident about what they might have seen or heard. The building held 24 units across 3 floors, housing a mix of young professionals, elderly retirees, and and small families drawn by reasonable rent and safe surroundings. On the third floor, William DeRoos answered the door with polite concern. He was 23, recently married, working odd jobs while his wife pursued secretarial training. DeRoos expressed shock at the news and cooperated fully with questions about the previous evening. He'd been home with his wife, he explained, watching television and going to bed early. His wife, nervous but supportive, confirmed his alibi without hesitation. The young couple seemed genuinely disturbed by their neighbor's death. DeRoos even offered to help with the investigation, however possible, suggesting other tenants who might have seen suspicious activity. His willingness to assist and his wife's corroborating testimony satisfied investigators, who moved on to other potential witnesses. The investigation continued through the afternoon and evening, but no one suspected that evil had been hiding in plain sight, just 2 floors above Rita's apartment. The evidence room at Burlington Police Department gradually filled with items from Rita Curran's apartment photographs, fingerprint cards, personal belongings, and those seemingly insignificant cigarette butts found near her body. Detective Harris catalogued each piece carefully, hoping one would provide the breakthrough they desperately needed. Investigation protocols in 1971 relied heavily on witness testimony, fingerprint analysis, and careful detective work. DNA testing remained decades in the future, making those cigarette butts just another piece of collected material rather than the key to solving the case. Harris had them analyzed for blood type and stored with other physical evidence, not knowing they contained genetic information that would eventually identify Rita's killer. Mrs. DeRoos' alibi statement joined the growing file of witness interviews. Her nervous but consistent testimony that her husband had been home all evening seemed credible to investigators, focused on finding external suspects. The couple appeared genuinely shocked by their neighbor's death and eager to help with the investigation. DeRoos himself proved to be a cooperative witness, offering observations about other tenants and suggesting possible security weaknesses in the building. His helpful demeanor and solid alibi effectively removed him from suspicion. Investigators appreciated residents who took community safety seriously and contributed to their effort. The questioning continued for days, extending beyond the apartment building to Rita's workplace, church, and social circles. Teachers, students, parents, fellow parishioners, and community members all submitted to interviews about Rita's relationships and any potential threats she might have faced. But the killer had been careful, maintaining his normal routine and presenting a facade of concerned neighbor. His wife's false testimony provided perfect cover, creating an alibi that satisfied investigators eager to move beyond obvious suspects to more promising leads. As days passed, without significant developments, the cigarette evidence was boxed and stored, waiting patiently for future technology to unlock its secrets. The case file grew thicker, with dead-end leads and false hopes, while the true perpetrator continued living just floors above the scene of his crime. Street Joseph's Church overflowed with mourners on the sweltering afternoon of Rita Curran's funeral. Nearly 600 people packed the pews, filled the aisles, and spilled onto the front steps in an extraordinary outpouring of community grief. Teachers, students, parents, and neighbors came to honor a life cut devastatingly short and to support a family shattered by unthinkable loss. Rita's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Curran, sat in the front pew, clinging to each other and to their faith. Mrs. Curran clutched her rosary beads, the same ones Rita had used for evening prayers, while tears streamed down her weathered cheek. Her husband maintained stoic composure, his arm protective around his wife's shoulders, but his eyes revealed the depth of his anguish. Father Murphy delivered a homily celebrating Rita's gentle spirit and dedication to nurturing young minds. He spoke of her kindness to struggling students, her patience with difficult children, and her unwavering faith that had inspired everyone who knew her. His voice broke when he described visiting Rita's empty classroom, where student artwork still decorated bulletin boards and lesson plans lay unfinished on her desk. The church choir sang Rita's favorite hymns, their voices rising in harmonies that seemed to lift prayers directly to heaven. Amazing Grace filled the sacred space with such beauty that even hardened police officers wiped away tears. Detective Harris stood near the back, scanning faces for any sign of guilt or suspicious behavior, but seeing only genuine sorrow. After the service, the procession to Mount Calvary Cemetery stretched for blocks. Cars moved slowly through Burlington streets as residents stood on sidewalks in respectful silence. At the graveside, Mrs. Curran placed a single white rose on her daughter's casket and whispered a promise that would sustain her for decades. "We'll never stop looking for the truth, sweetheart. Never." As mourners dispersed into the humid afternoon, they carried with them a shared vow to remember Rita Curran and support her family's search for justice, no matter how long it might take. August faded into September, then October, and still Rita Curran's killer remained free. The initial surge of investigative energy gradually gave way to the grinding reality of a case growing cold. Detective Harris worked late into countless evenings, reviewing witness statements, following up on tips, and revisiting crime scene evidence, but no clear suspect emerged. The Curran family maintained their vigil of hope and prayer, but the weight of uncertainty grew heavier with each passing week. Mrs. Curran attended daily mass, lighting candles for Rita and praying for the strength to endure another day without answers. She kept Rita's bedroom exactly as it had been, her teaching materials organized on the desk, her clothes hanging neatly in the closet. Burlington's residents learned to live with an uncomfortable new reality. Parents walked children to school and kept closer watch during evening hours. Women checked apartment locks more carefully and avoided walking alone after dark. The easy trust of small-town life had been damaged, perhaps permanently. Rita's former students began the new school year with a substitute, a teacher who tried her best to fill an unfillable void. The children asked constant questions about Miss Curran's absence, creating emotional challenges for educators already struggling with their own grief and fear. At the police station, Rita's case file joined others on Detective Harris's desk, other unsolved crimes demanding attention and resources. The initial team of investigators was reassigned to new cases, leaving Harris to pursue leads alone during whatever time he could spare from current investigations. The physical evidence collected from Rita's apartment remained in storage, waiting for scientific advances that might someday unlock their secret. The cigarette butts, photographed and catalogued with careful attention, held genetic information that wouldn't be readable for decades. As autumn leaves fell and winter approached, the Curran family faced their first Thanksgiving and Christmas without Rita. Her empty chair at the dinner table served as a painful reminder that their beautiful daughter's killer still walked free somewhere, possibly living a normal life while they struggled with unending grief. By 1975, Rita Curran's murder had joined the ranks of Burlington's unsolved cases, filed away in boxes that gathered dust on evidence room shelves. Detective Harris had retired the previous year, carrying with him the frustration of promises he couldn't keep to the Curran family. New detectives occasionally reviewed the file, but without fresh leads or witnesses, the case remained stubbornly cold. The investigative tools available in the mid-negative 1,970 seconds had reached their limit. Fingerprint analysis had yielded no matches, witness testimony had provided no solid suspects, and the physical evidence offered no clear path forward. The cigarette butts remained in their evidence bags, properly stored, but scientifically silent in an era before DNA analysis. William DeRoos and his wife had quietly moved away from Burlington in 1973, drawn by job opportunities in other states. Their departure attracted no attention from law enforcement. They had been cleared as witnesses early in the investigation and were free to pursue their lives wherever they chose. To neighbors who remembered them, they were just another young couple seeking better opportunities elsewhere. The Curran family's routine of remembrance continued unabated. Every Sunday after Mass, Mrs. Curran lit a votive candle for Rita and whispered prayers for justice. The ritual had become as essential as breathing, a way to honor her daughter's memory and maintain hope that truth would eventually emerge. Rita's siblings had grown into adulthood, carrying the shadow of their sister's unsolved murder. They pursued careers, married, started families, but always with the awareness that Rita's killer remained free. Family gatherings inevitably included conversations about the case, sharing memories of Rita while wondering if they would ever know what happened that terrible July night. Burlington itself had evolved, growing larger and more diverse, but old-timers still remembered the gentle teacher whose death had shaken their community's sense of safety. New residents learned Rita's story from neighbors and local newspapers that marked anniversaries of her death with remembrance articles. The evidence box containing potential answers to a family's decades-long questions sat waiting in police storage, its contents preserved but unintelligible until science could catch up to the truth. William DeRoos drifted through the American West during the late 1970 seconds and early 1980 seconds, a restless soul seeking peace that remained perpetually out of reach. His wife accompanied him for several years, but the strain of carrying their shared secret eventually fractured their marriage. She could no longer bear the weight of knowing what her false testimony had protected. In California, DeRoos discovered Buddhism and threw himself into spiritual practice with the intensity of a man desperate for redemption. He studied meditation, attended retreats, and eventually took monastic vows at a mountain temple where silence was considered sacred. The saffron robes and shaved head offered external transformation, but inner peace remained elusive. Fellow monks found him troubled and inconsistent in his practice. During meditation sessions, he would fidget and whisper, his mind unable to find the stillness that Buddhist teachings promised. Teachers tried to guide him through techniques for releasing past trauma, but DeRoos could never fully explain the source of his spiritual turmoil. Drug use began as an attempt to quiet the voices of guilt and memory that plagued his thought. What started with occasional marijuana smoking escalated to harder substances, cocaine, heroin, anything that might provide temporary escape from the images of that July night in Burlington. The monastery expelled him when his addictions became obvious and disruptive. DeRoos' life became a cycle of brief sobriety, followed by destructive binges. He lived in cheap motels, homeless shelters, and sometimes on the streets, his appearance growing gaunt and haunted. Occasionally, he would attempt to contact his estranged wife, but she had changed her address and phone number multiple times to avoid him. The Buddhist meditation beads he carried became more superstition than spirituality, something to clutch during moments of panic or craving. He would finger them obsessively while walking city streets, their smooth surfaces worn by anxious handling, but providing no genuine comfort. His attempts at spiritual healing had failed, because true redemption required confession and accountability actions beyond his capacity or courage. The killer who had destroyed Rita Curran's life continued destroying his own through substances and self-deception. Burlington, Vermont entered the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, transformed by growth and modernization. But Rita Curran's memory remained woven into the community's collective consciousness. Her former elementary school displayed a memorial plaque near the main entrance, bearing her photograph and a simple inscription, "In memory of Rita Curran, beloved teacher, whose light continues to inspire." New teachers joining the school district learned Rita's story during orientation sessions that emphasized both her pedagogical excellence and the tragedy of her loss. Veteran educators who had known her personally shared memories of her classroom innovations, her patient work with struggling students, and her ability to make every child feel valued and important. The annual Rita Curran Memorial Scholarship, established by her family and funded through community donations, provided college assistance to local students pursuing education careers. Recipients were selected based on academic achievement and demonstrated commitment to nurturing young minds, qualities that had defined Rita's own teaching philosophy. Each summer, on the anniversary of her death, former students, now grown to adulthood, would visit Rita's grave at Mount Calvary Cemetery. They brought flowers, shared memories of her kindness, and told their own children about the teacher who had made such a profound impact during their elementary years. The stories passed from one generation to the next, ensuring Rita's influence extended far beyond her abbreviated lifetime. Local newspapers continued marking significant anniversaries with feature articles about the unsolved case, interviewing Detective Harris and other original investigators about leads that had been pursued and evidence that remained unexplained. These stories served as reminders to readers that Rita's killer had never been caught and that justice remained undelivered. The Burlington Police Department's cold case files grew thicker over the years, but Rita's murder stayed near the top of the stack. Young detectives would occasionally review the evidence, hoping fresh eyes might spot something that predecessors had missed, but the limitations of available forensic technology kept the case frustratingly stagnant. Rita's classroom, eventually reassigned to new teachers, kept alive her methods and philosophy through colleagues who had absorbed her approaches to reading instruction and student engagement. The Curran family's annual gatherings became sacred ceremonies of remembrance, bringing together siblings, spouses, children, and grandchildren to honor Rita's memory and renew their commitment to seeking justice. These events, typically held on Rita's birthday in November, combined celebration of her life with determination to never let her case be forgotten. Mrs. Curran, now in her 70s, remained the family's spiritual anchor, leading prayers and sharing stories that kept Rita's personality vivid for younger generations who had never met their aunt. She displayed Rita's framed school photographs, teaching certificates, and journals at every gathering, creating shrine-like arrangements that testified to a life of purpose and promise. Rita's siblings had built successful lives, careers in education, business, and public service, but each carried their sister's absence as a defining element of their identity. They spoke frequently about her theoretical pride in their accomplishments and imagined how she might have contributed to their children's upbringing as the devoted aunt she never had the chance to become. The family's collective commitment to keeping Rita's case active involved regular communication with Burlington police, advocacy for cold case review programs, and participation in victims' rights organizations. They wrote letters to newspapers, spoke at community events, and maintained relationships with journalists who covered unsolved crimes. During family reunions, Rita's empty chair remained set at the dinner table, a visual reminder of her permanent absence and the family's permanent hope for resolution. Younger cousins grew up understanding that Aunt Rita's story was both tragedy and inspiration, representing both the reality of evil in the world and the importance of never surrendering to despair. Mrs. Curran's rosary beads, inherited from her own mother, became the family's most treasured heirloom. She used them daily in prayers for Rita's soul and for the strength to endure another day without answers. The worn silver reflected decades of faithful handling and desperate petitions for justice. The ritual of remembrance sustained them through years of disappointment while keeping Rita's spirit alive for new generations committed to continuing the vigil their parents had begun. On a quiet morning in Riverside, California, William DeRoos died alone in a cheap motel room on the 15th of September, 1986. His body discovered by housekeeping staff after he failed to check out. The coroner's report listed the cause as drug overdose heroin mixed with alcohol, ending 15 years of increasingly desperate self-destruction following Rita Curran's murder. His death attracted no attention beyond the routine processing of another anonymous casualty in America's drug epidemic. No family members claimed the body, no friends attended the county cremation, and no obituary marked the passing of a man who had successfully erased his identity through years of addiction and anonymity. The few personal possessions found in his motel room, worn Buddhist prayer beads, faded photographs, and scattered drug paraphernalia were disposed of as unclaimed property. His wallet contained no identification linking him to Vermont or to the name that would have connected him to an unsolved murder case 3,000 miles away. In Burlington, the Curran family continued their decades-long vigil for justice, unaware that Rita's killer had been removed from the world by his own destructive choices. Mrs. Curran lit her Sunday candles and whispered prayers for truth to be revealed, not knowing that the object of her prayers for accountability was beyond earthly justice. Detective Harris, now fully retired but still haunted by unsolved cases, occasionally reviewed Rita's file and wondered if the killer might still be living somewhere under an assumed name. The possibility that he might have died naturally never occurred to investigators, who continued pursuing leads based on the assumption that the perpetrator remained alive and potentially identifiable. DeRoos' death certificate, filed in California's record system, contained no information that would have connected him to Vermont authorities. The bureaucratic systems of 1986 lacked the digital interconnectedness that might have flagged his name for cross-reference with other states' unsolved crimes. Rita's case file continued growing thicker with periodic review notes and new tips from citizens, while the man responsible for her death became anonymous, ash scattered in an unmarked California grave. The forensic revolution of the 1990 seconds and early 2000 seconds brought new hope to families of unsolved murder victims across America. DNA analysis, once limited to major laboratories and high-profile cases, gradually became accessible to local police departments dealing with cold cases that had languished for decades without resolution. Burlington Police Department's evidence storage facility underwent systematic review as new technology promised to unlock secrets hidden in old samples. The cigarette butts collected from Rita Curran's apartment in 1971, carefully preserved but scientifically useless for 30 years, suddenly represented potential breakthrough evidence. Detective Laura Mitchell, a specialist in cold case investigations, joined Burlington's force in 2018 with specific training in DNA analysis and forensic genealogy. Her background included successful resolution of several decades-old murders through genetic evidence, and she immediately identified Rita's case as a priority for modern testing. The original evidence had been stored properly, sealed in containers that protected genetic material from degradation. Mitchell submitted the cigarette samples to the State Forensic Laboratory with a formal request for full DNA analysis, a process that would have been impossible when the evidence was first collected. Mrs. Curran, now in her 80s, but still lighting weekly candles for Rita, received a phone call from Detective Mitchell explaining the new development. For the first time in decades, law enforcement offered genuine optimism about solving her daughter's case. The conversation left both women emotional but hopeful. The Curran family gathered for an emergency meeting to discuss the DNA testing timeline and prepare themselves for potential results. After 47 years of waiting, the possibility of finally learning their daughter's killer's identity felt both thrilling and terrifying. Technology that could have solved Rita's case within days, in 2018, was finally being applied to evidence that had waited patiently for science to catch up. The cigarette butts, dismissed as minor evidence in 1971, were about to become the key to justice that had been delayed but not denied. In March 2023, the Vermont State Forensics Laboratory completed DNA analysis of the cigarette evidence from Rita Curran's murder, extracting a complete genetic profile that had remained locked in those specimens for 52 years. The laboratory technician who processed the results couldn't have imagined the shockwaves that his findings would send through Burlington's law enforcement community. Detective Mitchell received the lab report on a routine Thursday morning, expecting another disappointing dead end that had characterized so many cold case investigations. Instead, she found herself staring at a computer screen that displayed an exact match. William DeRoos, whose genetic information was in the system from a previous arrest in California years before his death. The DNA evidence was conclusive and irrefutable, the same genetic material found on cigarettes left at Rita's murder scene matched perfectly with samples taken from DeRoos during his 1984 drug arrest in Los Angeles. But the revelation that stunned Mitchell most was the address listed in DeRoos' original witness statement, apartment 3B in Rita's building, just 2 floors above her home. Mitchell spent hours reviewing the original case files, discovering that DeRoos had been interviewed as a routine witness, had provided an alibi through his wife, and had been eliminated from suspicion early in the investigation. His helpful cooperation and apparent concern for community safety had masked the fact that he was Rita's killer, living directly above the scene of his crime. The implications were staggering. For months after the murder, Rita's family had grieved while her killer continued living in the same building, passing them in hallways, perhaps even expressing sympathy for their loss. The proximity of evil to innocence, of perpetrator to victims, challenged everything the community thought they understood about trust and safety. Mitchell immediately contacted her supervisor and the district attorney's office to report the breakthrough. Within hours, a team of investigators was reviewing every aspect of the original case with the knowledge that they had identified Rita Curran's murderer 52 years after his crime. The cigarette evidence had finally found its voice, speaking truth that human witnesses had been unable to provide. Detective Mitchell's first priority was locating William DeRoos' widow, the woman whose false alibi had protected a killer for over 5 decades. Finding her required extensive detective work, tracing marriage records, divorce documents, address changes, and social security information through multiple states and decades of bureaucratic records. Mrs. DeRoos, now in her 70s and living under her maiden name in Arizona, had spent 52 years carrying the weight of her lie. When Detective Mitchell and a local police officer appeared at her modest retirement community apartment, she knew immediately why they had come. Her face crumpled with decades of suppressed guilt and relief. The interview lasted 4 hours, during which Mrs. DeRoos confessed that she had lied about her husband's whereabouts on the night of Rita's murder. She revealed that William had left their apartment around midnight, claiming he needed cigarettes from a convenience store, and hadn't returned until nearly dawn, with scratches on his face and blood on his shirt. When police questioned them the next day, William had coached her to say he'd been home all evening watching television. She was 19 years old, terrified of her increasingly violent husband, and convinced that telling the truth would destroy their marriage and possibly put her own life in danger. Mrs. DeRoos described years of living with the knowledge that her husband had killed an innocent woman. She'd tried to convince herself that maybe he'd gotten into a fight with someone else, that perhaps the blood came from some other altercation, but deep down she knew the truth. After their divorce in 1978, she'd considered contacting police, but feared prosecution for her false testimony and worried that too much time had passed for her confession to matter. She'd followed news coverage of Rita's case over the years, suffering pangs of guilt every time she saw the family's appeals for information. Her final words to Detective Mitchell carried 5 decades of anguish. "I thought I was saving him, but I was just letting Rita's family suffer. I'm so sorry it took this long." Burlington Police Department scheduled a press conference for the 18th of April 2023 to announce the resolution of Rita Curran's 52-year-old murder case. The news had leaked gradually through law enforcement channels, creating anticipation among journalists, community members, and advocacy groups that followed cold case developments. The police station's main conference room overflowed with media representatives from across Vermont and neighboring states. Television cameras lined the back wall while newspaper reporters filled folding chairs arranged in neat rows. Detective Mitchell stood beside Chief Robert Thompson at a podium decorated with the Burlington Police Department seal. Chief Thompson began by acknowledging the extraordinary persistence of Rita's family and the dedication of investigators who had kept her case active across 5 decades. He praised the role of advancing forensic science in finally delivering justice, though he noted the bittersweet reality that the perpetrator was beyond earthly prosecution. Detective Mitchell presented the case details in clear, professional language, designed to respect both the victim's memory and the family's grief. She explained how DNA evidence had identified William DeRoos as Rita's killer, how his widow's confession had confirmed the timeline, and how the investigation had finally reached its conclusion. The Curran family sat in the front row, holding hands and listening with expressions that mixed relief, vindication, and lingering sorrow. Rita's surviving siblings had prepared a brief statement, thanking the police for their persistence and expressing gratitude that their sister's name had finally been cleared of any suggestion that her murder might have been. random, or connected to her personal relationships. Questions from reporters focused on the investigation's timeline, the role of DNA evidence, and the family's response to learning their daughter's killer had lived so close to the crime scene. Detective Mitchell answered professionally while acknowledging the emotional complexity of cases that span multiple generations. The press conference lasted 45 minutes, officially closing a case that had haunted Burlington for over half a century. The Curran family's public statement, read by Rita's youngest brother David, reflected 5 decades of Rita people over grief, hope, frustration, and ultimate vindication. Standing before microphones and cameras, his voice trembled with emotion as he spoke words the family had dreamed of delivering for 52 years. Today, we finally know the name of the person who took our beloved Rita from us, David began, holding a framed photograph of his sister in her teaching attire. William DeRoos was not a stranger who broke into her apartment or a random criminal who targeted her by chance. He was her neighbor, someone she probably greeted in the hallway, someone who seemed helpful to police investigating her death. The family's statement acknowledged the bittersweet nature of justice delayed. While they expressed gratitude for finally learning the truth, they also mourned the decades of uncertainty, false leads, and unanswered questions that had shaped their lives. Rita's parents had died without knowing their daughter's killer's identity, a particularly painful reality for surviving siblings. David spoke about Rita's enduring influence on her family and community, describing how her memory had inspired multiple generations to pursue education careers and community service. He mentioned the scholarship fund established in her name and the countless students who had benefited from programs created to honor her legacy. The statement also addressed forgiveness, a difficult concept when confronting the person responsible for such devastating loss. The family's Catholic faith had taught them about mercy and redemption, but applying those principles to their sister's murderer remained a profound spiritual challenge they would continue facing. Rita's photograph, held steady throughout the reading, showed a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, the image that had appeared on thousands of missing person flyers, memorial programs, and anniversary articles over 5 decades. Rita was taken from us, David concluded, but her spirit of love, teaching, and faith lives on in everyone she touched. Burlington's reaction to the DNA breakthrough reflected the complex emotions of a community that had lived with an unsolved murder for over half a century. Relief at finally having answers, mixed with shock at learning the killer had hidden among them, betraying the trust of neighbors who had considered him above suspicion. Residents who remembered William DeRoos described him as quiet and unremarkable, exactly the kind of neighbor who aroused no suspicion or concern. Elderly residents recalled him as polite but distant, someone who nodded hello in passing but rarely engaged in conversation. The revelation that this seemingly harmless young man had been capable of such violence challenged their assumptions about recognizing dangerous people. Rita's former colleagues and students, now middle-aged adults with children of their own, struggled with the proximity of evil to their beloved teacher. Many remembered DeRoos helping with the initial search efforts, offering suggestions about potential suspects, and expressing concern for community safety, all while concealing his own guilt. Current teachers at Rita's former elementary school organized a special assembly to discuss the case resolution with students, emphasizing both the importance of never giving up on justice and the reality that healing from tragedy takes many forms. They used Rita's story to illustrate perseverance, community support, and the eventual triumph of truth over deception. Churches throughout Burlington held special services acknowledging the case's resolution while offering prayers for both Rita's family and the broader community affected by decades of uncertainty. Pastor sermons focused on themes of justice, forgiveness, and the mysterious ways that truth eventually emerges from darkness. The apartment building where Rita lived and DeRoos concealed his crime became a place of pilgrimage for community members seeking closure. Residents left flowers outside the building and held an impromptu candlelight vigil, their flames flickering against the brick facade that had witnessed both terrible evil and enduring love. Burlington had finally confronted its most haunting secret, beginning a process of collective healing that would continue for years to come. The Curran family gathered in their traditional circle of remembrance, but this time their gathering carried a different emotional weight. After 52 years of lighting candles for unknown justice, they finally possessed the knowledge they had prayed for, while grappling with the reality that such knowledge could never restore lost time or bring Rita back. Mrs. Curran's sister, now the family matriarch, after her mother's death in 1998, led prayers that blended gratitude with continued grief. The family's Catholic faith had sustained them through decades of unanswered questions, but applying concepts of forgiveness and mercy to Rita's actual killer rather than an abstract evil proved emotionally complex. David reflected on the strange irony that Rita's murderer had died of drug overdose 15 years earlier, meaning their decades of hope for a trial and conviction had been impossible from the start. Justice had come in the form of truth rather than legal prosecution, a reality that felt both satisfying and incomplete. Rita's nieces and nephews, now adults with children of their own, spoke about explaining their aunt's story to the next generation. The case's resolution provided closure, while raising new questions about how to process inherited trauma and continued grief even after receiving long-sought answers. The family discussed establishing a new tradition to mark this milestone in their journey. They decided to continue lighting candles for Rita, but with prayers of thanksgiving for truth revealed, rather than petitions for truth to be discovered. The ritual would evolve to reflect their changed circumstances while maintaining connection to Rita's memory. Photographs, journals, and mementos that had served as evidence of Rita's interrupted life could now be treasured simply as remembrances of her completed story. The family's vigil for justice was over, but their celebration of Rita's life and influence would continue for generations. The scars of uncertainty had been replaced by the different but manageable pain of complete knowledge. Street. Joseph's Church, where Rita Curran had worshipped as a child and young adult, hosted a special memorial service on Sunday, the 7th of May, 2023, to mark the resolution of her case and celebrate her enduring impact on Burlington's community. The service drew hundreds of attendees, including many who had never known Rita personally but had been touched by her story over 5 decades. Father Patrick O'Brien, the current pastor, opened the service by acknowledging the complex emotions surrounding justice delayed but ultimately delivered. His homily focused on themes of persistence, faith during trials, and the mysterious ways that truth emerges from darkness. He spoke about Rita's life as a teacher and person of faith, emphasizing how her influence had extended far beyond her abbreviated lifetime. The church choir performed hymns that had been sung at Rita's funeral in 1971, their voices carrying memories across generations of worshippers. Amazing Grace and How Great Thou Art filled the sacred space with the same melodies that had comforted mourners 52 years earlier, now offering a different kind of solace. Community members shared testimonies about Rita's impact on their lives and families. Former students, now grandparents themselves, described her patience and encouragement. Fellow teachers spoke about methods and approaches they had learned from Rita that continued influencing their classrooms decades later. The service included prayers for Rita's family, for community healing, and surprisingly, for William DeRoos' soul, a demonstration of Christian forgiveness that challenged many attendees but reflected the church's teachings about redemption and mercy, even for those who commit terrible acts. Candles lit throughout the church created a warm glow that seemed to embrace everyone present, symbolizing hope that persists through darkness and light that ultimately overcomes evil. The service concluded with a benediction that sent participants into the community renewed in their commitment to supporting each other through both tragedy and triumph. In the quiet sanctuary of Street, Joseph's Church, Mrs. Curran's elderly sister Margaret lit a single white candle at the altar where Rita had served as a young girl, reading scripture and assisting with religious education classes. This candle represented not the desperate hope that had sustained the family for 52 years, but peaceful acceptance of truth finally revealed. The flame burned steadier than Margaret remembered previous candles burning, as if reflecting the family's transition from desperate petition to grateful acknowledgement. She knelt in the front pew, where 3 generations of Currans had prayed for justice, her arthritic hands folded around the same rosary beads her sister had clutched during decades of Sunday vigils. Behind her, Rita's surviving siblings, their adult children, and grandchildren filled several pews, representing the family tree that had grown and flourished despite the shadow of unsolved tragedy. They prayed together, using familiar words that now carried different meaning: thanksgiving rather than supplication, closure rather than desperate hope. The church's stained glass windows cast colored light across the assembled family, the same patterns Rita would have seen during her childhood, masses, and teenage confirmations. Margaret remembered her sister teaching Rita to pray the rosary in this very church, never imagining they would spend 5 decades seeking justice for her murder. Young voices joined elder ones in reciting prayers Rita had learned as a child, creating a bridge between past and present that honored memory while embracing future possibilities. The family's ritual of remembrance would continue, but transformed by knowledge rather than driven by desperate need. As the candle burned throughout their prayers, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since July 1971, genuine peace about Rita's story. The flame would eventually extinguish, but the light of truth would burn forever in their hearts and in Burlington's collective memory. 5 decades after Rita Curran's murder shattered Burlington's sense of safety, her story reached its final chapter not with a dramatic trial or conviction, but with the quiet revelation of truth that had patiently waited for science and conscience to converge. Her grave at Mount Calvary Cemetery, visited faithfully by family and former students for 52 years, now received flowers placed by hands no longer trembling with desperate hope. The headstone that had posed an unanswered question, why, after generations of mourners, could finally be read as a completed statement about a life that, though brief, had touched countless others through teaching, faith, and the inspiring persistence of those who loved her. Rita's influence extended far beyond her 24 years, through scholarships, teaching methods, and community bonds forged in the crucible of shared loss and eventual triumph. Detective Mitchell closed Rita's case file for the final time, adding her report to documents that told the complete story of evil revealed and justice delayed, but not denied. The cigarette evidence that had remained silent for 5 decades would be preserved as a testament to the power of advancing science and the importance of never discarding physical evidence, no matter how insignificant it might initially appear. Burlington's community had learned profound lessons about the masks evil can wear and the patience required for truth to emerge from deception. The case became a reminder that safety depends, not only on locks and alarms, but on the willingness to support each other through tragedy and to never surrender hope that justice will eventually prevail. Rita Curran's legacy lived on in classrooms, where her teaching methods still inspired students, in the scholarship recipients pursuing education careers, and in the faith of a family that had demonstrated how love endures beyond death and beyond the worst that humanity can inflict. Truth had finally risen, just as Mrs. Curran had always believed it would, even after 50 years of patient waiting.